The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. Cape Canaveral is one of the first place names to appear on any European map of North America. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that people from as far away as what is now the American Midwest traded with the indigenous people of Florida centuries before European contact. It's possible that the ancient Maya from Central and South America also interacted with native Floridians long before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century.
We believe that at the time that Europeans first arrived here, Ponce de Leon in 1513, there were literally hundreds of individual Native American groups. We can call them tribes or polities or whatever. Over time, some of them had banded together. The Appalachee Indians up in the area around Tallahassee and Leon and Jefferson County were one well-organized tribe or group with elite leaders and priests and a hierarchy of officials, both religious and political, maybe 50,000 people. Here in parts of South or Central Florida and down in South Florida, you probably had some smaller groups in the interior. But then the Calusa on the southwest Florida coast, an extraordinary society.
At the time of European contact, the native populations of Florida had complex societies, elaborate systems of trade, and their own ancient religions. The Calusa Indians in southwest Florida had a powerful chief who lived at what we call Mound Key.
When I first was there as an undergraduate in the 1960s, I was blown away by these huge archaeological sites with mounds and mounds on mounds and ramps and everything else. And the Calusa developed life in what was essentially a water world. They learned how to harvest the shell and fish that came out of the shallow Gulf waters, brought it in and used it. We know now that they also grew plants that they used too. So if we look at their art preserved from sites like Key Marco, if we look at their artifacts in that, it's different than if I look at what you find up in northwest Florida from the Appalachee or over here among the Indians that are known as the Ais, who lived along the Indian River and the coast in this area. So they shared some traits, but there are also distinct societies with their own specific ways of life and so forth. And interestingly enough, there are many, many different languages that were spoken in Florida, and that many of them seem to be, what we know about them, unrelated to other southeastern Indian languages that were spoken by the Creek or the Choctaw or the Cherokee.
About 1,000 years ago, agricultural communities were established in what would become the southeastern and midwestern United States, and what is called the Mississippian world flourished. Peninsular Florida is excluded from maps of the Mississippian world primarily because corn was not grown here.
Mississippian world is a term that we as modern archaeologists kind of superimpose on the landscape of the southeastern United States and part of the midwestern United States. It really excludes Florida, at least peninsular Florida. It will include the panhandle. It's kind of time transgressive. It can move, the boundaries can move, so it's not hard and fixed. But usually within what we call the Mississippian world are farming societies who are organized as chiefdom level socio-political organization, and they tend to be involved in these large-term exchange networks. And they're full-time farmers. They're growing large fields of maize. But we do see within the Mississippian world kind of pockets or areas where still hunters and gatherers persist. So while we use the word Mississippian, we use the word Mississippian world, we really use it in a really general sense, broad brushed, because there is going to be diversity within the Mississippian world.
In addition to growing maize or corn, the Mississippian cultures were known for their construction of platform mounds on which they would build houses, towns, temples, and burial buildings. The largest chiefdom in the Mississippian world was in a ceremonial complex at Cahokia across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis.
The 10th century AD kind of set the stage, I think, for a radical turning point in southeastern prehistory. This is the time that you see the rise and the formation of this megacenter that today we call Cahokia, which straddled really the Missouri and the Illinois side of the Mississippi River. It was the largest chiefdom ever in North America. Then you see in its wake smaller chiefdoms occur throughout the Midwest and the southeastern United States. You start to see most groups at this time in the southeast or the Mississippian world kind of turning towards maize agriculture. Some more intensive than others, but we start to see that becoming really an important part of their domestic economy. And the other thing you see at this point in time is you see that long-distance exchange networks, which had been for the previous few centuries kind of in a lull, are reanimated. And what you're going to see is this really unprecedented flow of exotic materials across the landscape of the Southeast and the Midwest. Now, this isn't the only time this happened. We do see large-scale exchange going on 2000 BC, then again during the Hopewell Woodland period. But really the Mississippian period, I think, is really writ large, much larger than before. And we're going to see a lot of stuff moving across the landscape. And so Cahokia, which is the largest one, really is early. It's surprising to people. It's the largest one, but it's from about 1050 AD maybe to 1150, 1200, and then it kind of breaks up or kind of reorganizes and becomes much, much smaller than it had been. So during this early time when Cahokia is thriving, we see them basically having connections as far away as Florida, into Louisiana, then up into Wisconsin to the north.
The St. John's culture of northeast Florida roughly coincides with the Mississippian world. The St. John's period begins about 500 AD and continues until European contact 1,000 years later. Ashley's research is demonstrating an extensive trade network between native Floridians and the thriving Mississippian culture.
So we're getting all these really minerals, stone, and metals that are kind of coming into Florida. And what's going out at the time is probably going to be things like coastal things that are exotic to landlocked people in Alabama or Missouri. Shells, whelk shells, bucicon shells, marginella shells, olive shells. Probably going to be things that are perishable, probably coastal Florida bird feathers, other types of things. Yopon holly, which they make the ceremonial black drink out of, is from a holly tree that grows really in the coastal plain area. So you see things that are everyday here in Florida are exotic to people in the interior, and they kind of want those things. So we probably see a lot of exchange going on and alliance building over great distances. And some of these exotic materials like copper and these finely finished pieces of copper like long-nosed god masks are probably part of these alliance ceremonies between groups that are a great distance apart. Because Cahokia being in the St. Louis, Missouri, East St. Louis, Illinois area, they really want things that are a great distance away, coastal resources. So they're probably securing alliances with groups in Florida to kind of secure these things.
Archaeology enthusiast C.B. Moore was the first to excavate many Indian mounds in Florida. He traveled up the St. Johns River in his steamship the Gopher in the late 1800s. Moore carefully documented what he found during his excavations, but his work did not meet the standards of modern archaeology. Still, Moore was the first to uncover Mississippian artifacts in Florida, and Ashley is expanding on his work.
In one instance, near one of the mounds, we found what we call a ritual midden or special event midden. And in there, we're getting incredibly large amounts of animal bone from what they're eating, but in really large amounts, suggesting this is feasting that's going on. We're also finding pottery that's much larger in size than normal pottery, and also kind of much smaller in size. So there's really a wide range there. Some of the pots, which are broken, look like they were pretty pristine. They really hadn't been used much, so they may have been actually crafted or constructed for these kinds of events. We're also getting exotic materials. Exotic materials usually only come from the mounds. So we're in this one little ritual midden, we're getting pieces of copper. We've uncovered 2 Cahokia side notch points that archaeologists from Cahokia have verified. We're finding pieces of mica. We're finding lots of hematite. We're finding a large number of bone pins, P-I-N-S, which were probably hairpins that they're using. Some of them are really very ornately decorated. Some of them have hematite or red ochre kind of pressed into the incisions that would really kind of stand out. So it's not your everyday garbage. So we think that this is an area where they're feasting, they're making craft material, they're crafting, they're making ritual items, they're probably making some of the items that they're going to place with the bodies, which is only 50 meters from this ritual area. So we're seeing copper that's coming in as sheet copper, and then they're taking that sheet copper and they're just wrapping it, using it as foil around maybe an artifact they make out of shell or an artifact they make out of wood or bone. But we're also seeing finished forms coming. These one artifacts are called long-nosed god maskets, and they would have been worn in the ear, and they're kind of shield-shaped, large kind of goggle kind of eyes there, and we believe that these are made at Cahokia. And there have been various numbers that have found, but only about 7 or 8 pairs of them. And we have a pair that C.B. Moore found from the Grant Mound. And so this is, a bunch of fisher hunter-gatherers who have all this incredible exotic material that we're finding in ritual areas and in mound areas. So this is really probably part of their social reproduction. It's part of their ceremonies. It's part of being St. John's too at this site, is to be able to acquire these things from great distances away.
Archaeology has proven that pre-Columbian people in northeast Florida traded with the Mississippian world. The cross-Gulf travel theory proposes the idea that the ancient Maya came to southwest Florida prior to European contact. One researcher has followed the oculate being from South America to Mexico and possibly Florida.
The images of this man that clearly show a connection all have these wide eyes. And no one argues that it means extrasensory perception, large wisdom, being the window to the mind. He's one of the ways that you can follow this man who is mostly always flying or attached to an agricultural sub-deity, let's call it that, like Tlaloc, who is the deity of rain in Mexico. He has very wide eyes that in that art history are called goggle eyes. But the research is not connected to where I started with it. So that's what's fascinating.
The oculate man image evolves over time and changes from place to place. He shows up as many different deities.
It's always a surprise to see that the large maize corn cultures all created a deity for, of course, what kept them alive, the corn and maize. And this creation, in each case, even though the cultures were sometimes thousands of miles away, they envisioned this man as a separate person, but with the same legend. That's the astounding part. And most profoundly, that he appeared out of nowhere, and he went away to where he said he would return. So there are many things that are alike all the way up. But as you can assume, the creative people in each of these cultures were all either untrained or had very little to do with each other, so they used the materials that were nearest to them. Some were all stone, some were ceramic, some were almost impossible to work with. So but they still expressed this deity. So it, of course, took different shapes. he was a shapeshifter. And in one section, moving up into Mexico, he becomes almost like the Nike icon, something so simple that you would never know what it was unless you connected it back to many, many other cultures and saw the evolution.
Another recurring image that keeps appearing in Starr's research is a circular symbol surrounded by smaller circles.
Important to know is that I've been doing the same research for 17 years. Around year 7 or 8, I started to see the same things happening in all of the objects that had all the other perfect relationships to this deity. One of them was a circle with smaller circles all the way around. Sometimes there was 1 or 2, sometimes there were 40 on the same on the same object. And they never were without their companions, which was indications of agriculture, indications of the wide-eyed man. All of that went together. And after about 5 or 6 years, I decided, well, what would inspire people who were maize-based cultures and droughts would kill them all in their craft and in daily life. And I thought, man, if you just cut a cob of corn in half, you get the same shape, the circle with the circles around, the kernels. And once I started really looking at that and connecting it, it was then apparent to me that I could follow that too.
Starr has followed the symbols of the corn-based culture of the Maya and concluded that they embarked on a journey to find their god in Florida.
When I got to the Yucatan, and I realized another big kind of paradigm that had been going on, drought and pilgrimage. And where do you go on a pilgrimage? You go to the temple you have built, a pyramid-like thing in most cases, to the deity of corn and maize in every case. And when you follow the pilgrimage lines, and you also already understand that the deity made a statement that he would return, and you were at the end of the road up there in the Yucatan, and the drought was killing you all, you would, if you were hypothesized yourself in the situation, you would want to find him. And he said he went off the coast of the Yucatan. And I do believe that the Maya had seen the Caribbean and were not afraid of the Gulf Current, especially on the fall equinox, when the loop is low, that they, in desperation, may have taken what they needed. They'd have to have males and females, but I believe they were there before.
The plausibility of the cross-Gulf travel theory is supported by the fact that the ancient Maya were accomplished mariners known for constructing very large canoes.
These were sailing vessels that could seat 25, they were 8 or 9 feet across and heavy duty and had different bow and stern than other types of pointed canoes. I think because of their mathematical genius, their ability to have orientation from the stars, these were ideal mariners.
Contemporary Maya from southwest Florida performed traditional dances and ceremonies at the Florida Folk Festival. Starr believes that the ancient Maya came to the same area when devastating droughts occurred on the Yucatan as early as the 9th century, and that they ended up around Lake Okeechobee.
When you follow by hypothesizing that the drought may have driven people off the coast, either to go to places they were familiar with already, or to just follow Kukulkan to wherever he went, you would bring something with you. They were big traders and merchants, so you would bring your gifts, and once I had read enough about what they might bring, I started looking for evidence that these are maybe the only things that were ever left in Florida. And they became abstract things like a caracara, a crested caracara bird, very important to the royalty, that they would have carried that, even feathers, of course, but that bird, when you start to map where these birds are, I was astounded and thrilled to find out that there was a whole section in the center of Florida around Lake Okeechobee that there are some of these crested caracaras. They don't fly much. They wouldn't have migrated. They usually chase people on the ground and chase animals. So how did they get there? Then I also would bring the honeybee, stingless, which are still being raised in Cuba and Caribbean, because it goes directly with the maize. And I would have brought maize. Now, to start new crops in a land that you must probably already know is limestone-based land. And that was why I saw the Gulf Current low in September, that if you just made the hook around, you'd be thrown off on the coast of Florida. And when I looked closer from satellite to the Caloosahatchee River, followed it in, noticed the cornlands today, like LaBelle and around there, then went back to Jerry Melange's book and read the chapter again, written by William Sears, who always believed this and had found the corn pollen under microscope, which is more of a positive theory now than ever, that these were Mesoamerican-based ceremonial centers.
The topic of kind of trans-Gulf, Maya, Mesoamerica, Central America, Florida interaction has been around for a long time. Sometimes it's in favor, sometimes it goes out of favor. I think people are reconsidering it in the last few years because we're seeing so much evidence of people exchanging things and moving across the landscape more than we thought about in the past. So it's something that I think that is viable and it's very possible. I think we're going to need the empirical evidence to show that. But the fact that we're seeing people in Florida doing exchange with groups that are in Missouri, that we're seeing people in the Southwest exchanging with people in Mexico, that groups really were, pre-Columbian groups really were contacting with others and exchanging things with others over great distances. And sometimes we've always thought, maybe in the past, that maybe all these are middlemen traders that have traded to one group, who trades with another group, who trades with another group, and eventually gets a great distance by doing that. In some instances, we may have evidence where groups are actually questing. Maybe they're going directly to those sources or to people near those sources, or groups are sending emissaries great distances away to establish contacts. So there's more direct diplomacy going on between groups that are a great distance away than instead of a series of interlocking or interlinking middlemen traders.
Beginning in the 16th century, the Spanish and other Europeans would decimate the native populations of Florida with unknown diseases, slavery, war, and forced relocation. Prior to that, the indigenous populations of Florida had more cooperative interactions with cultures distinctly different from their own.
These groups, they exchanged with other groups. They had communications over broader areas. They just didn't live by their river or by their stream or just on the ocean. That was it. Sure, those areas may have provided their everyday subsistence, the food that they needed, but basically other things are going on, that there's ritual, that there's social life, there's political life, and those things may have required them to make contacts or make alliances with groups a great distance away. So I think we need to remember it's not just locally, it's thinking about how people are interacting at much broader scales.
When Spanish ships first appeared along Florida's coast, it signaled the end of the sophisticated cultures that had thrived here, establishing complex trade networks. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
And by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org.